Welcome to President's Day at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Museum in Abilene, Kansas. My name is Julie, and I'm an educator with the Eisenhower Foundation. Today, we are going to be learning about two of President Eisenhower's most impactful programs, NASA and the Interstate Highway System. We will also be taking a look at some primary sources related to these two topics: photographs, documents, and artifacts. In fact, you will have the opportunity to look at some artifacts from right here at the Eisenhower Museum. So, locate that chat icon on your screen and get ready to participate. I will be asking you some questions, and I would love to answer any questions that you might have. Right now, I'm standing in front of the NASA display in the Promoting Prosperity Gallery of the museum. You probably know NASA for its spaceships and astronauts, but how did it come to be? Let's take a look at a timeline that will show us the creation of NASA. It all started with a Soviet satellite called Sputnik. Following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in something called the Cold War. Both countries competed to prove their superiority. The space race was a part of the Cold War. It was a way for the United States and the Soviet Union to prove their superiority in space, the final frontier. America was quickly drawn into this competition when the USSR launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Even though it looks impressive in pictures, it was actually a very small satellite, about 23 inches in diameter. This exercise ball is the same size as the Sputnik satellite. Are you as surprised as I was to discover its actual size? This little satellite caused quite a stir in the United States. People were worried about what the satellite might be carrying. What did the USSR put on the satellite? Nuclear weapons? Were the Soviets spying on the United States? It was concerning to many Americans. The Soviet Union quickly followed with another first in space. A month later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika, the first animal launched into space. The goal was to test the effect of space on animals. Unfortunately for Laika, it was a one-way trip. She died shortly after takeoff. Fear of Soviet technology and scientific advancements prompted the U.S. to move quickly to advance space technology. President Eisenhower established the President's Scientific Advisory Committee a couple weeks after Sputnik 2. The committee's purpose was to advise the President on scientific matters, and specifically those related to national defense. As you can imagine, the United States was anxious to put a satellite into space. The United States Navy tried to launch their own satellite, the Vanguard TV-3. However, the U.S. venture into space didn't go as planned. The Vanguard rocket with a satellite was launched on December 6, 1957. It rose 4 feet and then crashed and fell. The U.S. Army was the next to launch a rocket. Explorer 1 was launched on January 31st, 1958, and was a success. Much of the success was due to the human computers who worked on the Explorer project. So, what exactly are human computers? If you like math, this would be the job for you. There were actually a team of women mathematicians who computed Explorer's trajectory. Believe it or not, there was a time when we had no computer machines like we have now. People had to do the mathematical calculations required. At NASA, women did all the math and science calculations for aircraft and space missions in the early 1960s. They were called human computers. Among the hundreds of women hired for these jobs, NASA employed nearly 80 Black women as human computers. Their story is told in the book and movie Hidden Figures. Give me a thumbs up if you've seen it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. In April of 1958, President Eisenhower, aware of the Soviets' dominance in outer space, called for the creation of a civilian National Aeronautics and Space Agency, known as NASA. This picture shows President Eisenhower asking Congress to pass legislation to create a civilian space agency. At that time, space projects were being done by the military. A civilian agency would be made up of citizens instead of the military only. Eisenhower felt a civilian agency would be much more efficient and be able to accomplish more in the field of space science and technology. Ike's goal was that outer space be devoted to peaceful and scientific purposes. The Soviets continued to press forward with space exploration. In May 1958, the Soviets launched Sputnik 3. This provided a strong push for Congress to pass the National Aeronautics and Space Act, or NASA. NASA became a reality soon after. President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, or NASA, on July 29, 1958, creating both a committee and agency that were focused on American space exploration and dominance. The formation of NASA meant the U.S. was committed to winning the space race. On December 19, 1958, President Eisenhower was part of another first in space. He became the first man to have his voice broadcast from space. He shared America's wish for peace on Earth and goodwill toward men everywhere. Let's take a listen.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. My message is a simple one. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere.
So, in this day and age, satellites transmit data all the time. But at this time in history, it was unheard of. How do you think this message made Americans feel? What do you think the rest of the world thought about the president's message? In April of 1959, an exciting chapter in NASA history opened. Have you ever thought about being an astronaut or going into space someday? Because of this event, boys and girls all over the United States dreamed of becoming astronauts. A new type of hero was born. The Mercury 7, our first astronauts, were introduced. These 7 military pilots would be the first Americans to travel in space. Project Mercury's goal was to put the first man in space. Do you think choosing the first astronauts was easy? It was not. A committee reviewed and screened the records of 508 military test pilots. They were interviewed and took written tests, which narrowed the pool of candidates down to 32. Each of those candidates endured difficult physical, physiological, and mental examinations, including total body X-rays, pressure suit tests, cognitive exercises, and a series of difficult interviews. These 7 men were chosen out of the original 508. Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Donald Slayton. They all became instant celebrities. So if you were looking for a job, you would probably read the job description to decide if it was a job you wanted to do or were qualified to do. Could this be the job for you? This letter is a job description for a Mercury astronaut, and it is a primary source document. After the first 7 were chosen, There was a need to hire more astronauts for the Mercury program. Let's examine this letter and see what we can discover. So, what agency is sending this letter and when was it sent? We can find that up at the top of the letter. There's the date, and there is the name of who was sending it. So it was sent by NASA on June 17th, 1959. And what agency received this letter? When agencies receive documentation, they stamped it. And so we can see the two stamps with the agency's name and date right there. It was received by the Space Task Group. So the Space Task Group was responsible for building the spacecraft and choosing the astronauts. So it'd be pretty important that they know what the job description was. Let's take a look at what the astronauts were required to do. So here's the actual position, title, and the duties of a Mercury astronaut. So as we read through this, it gives us all kinds of information on all the different things that they were required to do. I see right off the bat where it says participates in indoctrination. That's a really big word. Indoctrination means the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. So training to be a Mercury astronaut was very tough, and the astronauts needed to accept NASA's program without complaining or questioning it. Read through the rest of the description and see what other words jump out at you. What else do you see are the requirements of a Mercury astronaut? I see that there are various simulation tests where they're practicing in conditions that were like a real space situation. I see this word, telemetry. So that means the collection of measurements or data from remote places using special instruments. I wonder why an astronaut would need to know that skill. How would that help them? Down at the bottom, I see lots of things that we might be familiar with when we think about astronauts, especially this word, the word centrifuge. And I have a picture of a centrifuge machine right here, and you may have seen it in movies that show astronauts in training. So a centrifuge simulates the G-forces of a launch. All right. We also see along the right side of the letter a whole list of names. They probably work for the Space Task Group with the Mercury project, and once they've read it, they initial it or mark off their name. I also see something really interesting down at the bottom. Do you see the word space files? And then we see some names written in pencil. Let's take a closer look at that. So under space files, it says copies to Shepard, Shira, Carpenter, Glenn. Do you recognize these names? Where did we see those names before? Why do you think they should read this letter with a job description for a Mercury astronaut? Before men were put into space, however, the United States put a couple of monkeys into space. A rhesus monkey named Miss Abel and a squirrel monkey named Miss Baker went into space to determine its effect on living organisms. In the 1950s, scientists weren't certain that the human body could survive in a weightless environment such as space. Remember Leica, right? Miss Baker, who is pictured here, and Miss Abel made a 16-minute flight in a Jupiter rocket. The two were recovered in perfect health. One of the honors bestowed upon Miss Baker was from the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. The society expressed support for the carefully controlled scientific use of all animal astronauts for the mutual benefit of man and animals. Unfortunately, Miss Abel died shortly after the flight due to complications from surgery that were not related to her space flight. But Miss Baker enjoyed 25 years of retirement from her astronaut duties. Back to Miss Abel, a couple interesting facts about her. She came from a zoo in Kansas. And a monkey representing Miss Abel is in the movie Night at the Museum 2. Might have to go back and take a look at that. President Eisenhower was part of another first. He felt it was important to get to know the Soviet premier better. So he invited Premier Nikita Khrushchev to the United States for an official state visit. Remember, this was during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But President Eisenhower believed it would benefit both countries. President Eisenhower's invitation marked the first time a Soviet head of state received an invitation to the White House. While visiting the White House, Premier Khrushchev presented President Eisenhower with a very unusual gift. Let's take a look at it a little closer. He presented President Eisenhower with a wooden box containing a model of a lunosphere, which we can see right here in this picture. It's made of pentagonal pennants. And we can take a look at the actual lunosphere given to President Eisenhower in our NASA display. So let's take a look at that. So here's the actual sphere given to President Eisenhower. The real lunosphere was placed in a Luna 2 spacecraft and filled with an explosive charge designed to burst so that the pennants would be deposited on the moon. Each pennant was inscribed with CCCP, which is the Russian abbreviation for Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. It was the first man-made object to reach the moon. Khrushchev gave it to President Eisenhower 2 days after the real lunosphere reached the moon. I think the expressions on the two leaders' faces are interesting. They kind of tell a story all their own. Nikita Khrushchev looks very proud. Do you think he might be bragging a little about the Soviets' achievement? And I wonder what President Eisenhower is thinking. Maybe he's thinking, just wait and see what we have in store. It would be interesting to know, wouldn't it? We have some other really cool artifacts. Also on display is a helmet from Gemini 4. It was the first multi-day mission and the first to have its launch televised. We also see a telegram congratulating President Eisenhower on his speech that we just heard, and it says, "Your voice is out of this world." And finally, there in the middle, we have an actual moon rock from the Apollo 15 trip to the moon in 1971. This piece was part of a 21-pound chunk of moon brought back, and we have it on loan from NASA. NASA's Mercury project continued through President Eisenhower's second term in office. And on May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard made the first Mercury flight. Alan was the first American in space in this 15-minute flight. Even though this event happened a few months after President Eisenhower left office, credit for the success of the Mercury flight is often attributed to him. On July 9th, 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. This was one of the most watched TV events in history. The moon landing happened 4 months after President Eisenhower's death, so he didn't get a chance to see this historic event. But the civilian space agency created by Dwight Eisenhower truly made an iconic impression on the citizens of Earth. The Soviets never landed a person on the moon. NASA invented many new things through the space program, and innovations continue to be created. There are probably many things you use every day that are a result of NASA ingenuity. The innovations created by NASA and the space program have impacted our lives in many ways. Let's take a look at just a few of those innovations. Creating cameras small enough to fit onto spacecraft and having scientific quality has led to many of our cell phones having this same type of camera. NASA developed headsets to allow astronauts to communicate hands-free without wires. Scratch-resistant lenses came from attempts to develop diamond-hard coatings for aerospace systems. We have CAT scan technology and radiography thanks to NASA. NASA's innovations into shock absorption materials, along with robotics, are being used to create more functionally dynamic artificial limbs. Infant formulas now contain a nutritional enrichment ingredient due to NASA-sponsored research. In the 1960s, a NASA researcher was trying to make computers more interactive, which led to the invention of the computer mouse. How many of you have Nike Air Trainers? They wouldn't exist today if it weren't for suit construction technology developed by NASA. And you can thank NASA for that good night's sleep on a memory foam mattress. This incredible foam was developed by NASA to help make airline pilot seats more comfortable. The space program created the first portable laptop. Black & Decker worked with the Space Administration to build tools to use for moon exploration and sample collection. The Dustbuster was created as a result of that work. Ear thermometers use infrared astronomy technology. And NASA developed material to protect astronauts from extreme temperatures in space. This technology later was developed to use in homes as insulation. President Eisenhower's leadership and foresight created a space program which would continue to grow and create innovations into the following century. The United States is seen around the world as the leader in space exploration. Let's learn about another one of President Eisenhower's iconic programs, the Interstate Highway System, by taking a ride on I-35 and I-70 at Salina, Kansas, near President Eisenhower's boyhood home of Abilene, Kansas.
Right now, I'm in the Becoming Ike and Mamie Gallery of the museum. This part of the museum highlights Ike's early military career. To understand President Eisenhower's passion for the interstate system, we have to go all the way back to 1919, when he was a young lieutenant in the Tank Corps of the Army. He took part in something called the Transcontinental Motor Convoy, which went from Washington, D.C. all the way to San Francisco, California. The experience proved to be a memorable one and had a great impact on him.
The roads varied from average to non-existent, Ike was quoted as saying. And on the picture to the right, Ike wrote at the bottom, hoping it will hold, referring to that rickety bridge. These comments provide pretty good clues about the success of the convoy. Let's take a look at a few artifacts from Ike's time with the Tank Corps. In the display is a convoy pennant that commemorates Ike's participation in the motor transport convoy. There's also a gold Tank Corps flag. This was given to the parents of a soldier in the tank corps, and they could hang it in their window. Ike also received some gifts from the soldiers that he commanded. Displayed is a lamp and a silver cigarette holder. Ike was admired for his strong leadership abilities. Also notice the 3 hats in the display. The campaign hat on the left, the metal combat hat in the middle, and the service cap on the right. Ike wore all 3 of these while he was in the tank corps. In a moment, you will get to see a video of Ike participating in the Army convoy. Look for Ike and one of these hats.
This is the route the convoy took. 81 motorized Army vehicles traveled 3,251 miles from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California. The purpose was to test how mobile military vehicles could be during wartime conditions. The expedition was not easy because road conditions were so poor. It took the convoy 62 days to complete the trip, going about 6 to 10 miles per hour. Can you imagine going clear across the United States at only 6 to 10 miles per hour? I can't imagine going a few miles at only 6 to 10 miles per hour. Through this experience, Ike understood the need for improved roads and highways. This short video shows some of the highlights and struggles of the convoy. Don't forget to look for Ike's hat. What are some of your impressions about the motor convoy? Imagine you were on the convoy with Ike. How would you describe your experience in a letter home to your parents? And by the way, which hat was Ike wearing? It was the campaign hat. The German Autobahn Highway also made a lasting impression on then Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower during World War II. If the convoy showed the worst in road travel, the Autobahn showed the best. The Autobahn helped troops and equipment move quickly and efficiently throughout Germany. Ike realized the benefit a highway like the Autobahn would have for the United States. Right now, I'm in the Interstate System Highway display of the museum. When Dwight Eisenhower became the 34th president in 1953, building an interstate highway system became a top priority. After the war, Americans enjoyed increased prosperity. More people had cars and wanted to travel. President Eisenhower worked hard to make the interstate system a reality. His goals for an interstate highway system were provide safe roads for travel to meet the needs of the growing population. Highways would be 4 lanes made of concrete with uniform signage to create safer and faster travel. Provide more direct and efficient routes to assist in helping the expanding economy. Industrial and major population centers would be connected. Freight could be transported across the country more efficiently. Provide a quick and safe way of moving people and the military in case of a national emergency to strengthen national security. Military bases would be connected to the interstate system. President Eisenhower worked with Congress to approve his plan for an interstate system. There was a great deal of debate in Congress about the highway plan, most of it centered around funding. President Eisenhower and Congress finally came to a compromise. The federal government would provide 90% of the funding, leaving the remaining 10% to the states. Each state would be responsible for planning the details of the highway in their state. President Eisenhower signed the Highway Act on June 29, 1956. This is a copy of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, the act that created the Interstate Highway System. This document is a primary source. So let's take a closer look at it to find out more information. How will money be raised to help build the interstate? So if we look at the bottom of that first paragraph, it says taxes on motor fuel, tires, and trucks and buses. It also states the short title of the act. Down at the very bottom, you can see short title. All right, it says this title may be cited as the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. So, do you think there's a long title? This next page will probably help us find that. What is the long title and why? And that can be found right there. National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. So defense was added because its primary importance was to the national defense. And how many years does Congress think will be needed to complete the entire system? You can find that answer right there. 13 years. And if we read on, it says the states will all complete their highway projects simultaneously or at the same time. Do you think that sounds like a reasonable goal? We will find out. The last page contains the signatures, which made it a law. The date, June 29th, 1956, is stamped on the page. And we see Dwight Eisenhower's signature right at the bottom. We also see the signature of the Speaker of the House and the acting president of the Senate, pro tem. So, unfortunately, President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act at Walter Reed Army Hospital, where he was recovering from surgery for stomach issues. Even though this was such an important piece of legislation for him, it was signed with little fanfare. The original act authorized the creation of 41,000 miles of highway at a cost of $25 billion. President Eisenhower believed the Interstate Highway System was one of the most important projects of his presidency. So, who was the first to start building the interstate under the new act? Several states claim to be the first, and there is some debate between Kansas and Missouri about who was the first to begin construction. An 8-mile section of highway west of Topeka, Kansas, was the first stretch of highway completed under the new act. It was opened on November 14th, 1956. Missouri, however, began the first construction project when they started building the new Missouri River Bridge in 1956. It was completed in 1960. All right, so when was it finished? And you remember how many years Congress decided it would take to build the interstate system, right? 13 years. How many years do you think it actually took? It took about 35 years for the interstate to be completed as originally planned under the act. The last segment opened on October 14th, 1992 through Glenwood Canyon, Colorado. Coincidentally, this was on Dwight Eisenhower's 102nd birthday. In honor of President Eisenhower, legislation was passed that changed the name of the system to the Dwight Eisenhower System of Interstate and Defense Highways. It was signed by President George Bush on October 3rd, 1990. Dwight Eisenhower's son, John, is pictured here second from the left for the unveiling of the Eisenhower Interstate System sign on July 29th, 1993. Let's take a look at one of the actual signs we have on display. This is in our Interstate Highway System display in the museum. Can you guess why the sign has a circle of 5 stars? If you guessed that it's because President Eisenhower was a 5-star general, you are correct. It was to honor his military service. The impact of the interstate system on our economy and the lifestyle of Americans is immeasurable. I think we can all appreciate President Eisenhower's foresight and wisdom in ensuring these programs were created and that they flourished. Over time, President Eisenhower has been ranked as one of the top 5 presidents in history, and we are very proud to share a couple of his accomplishments with you today. Thank you for joining us today. To find out more about the many programs we offer, both in person and online, you can scan the QR code or go to eisenhowerfoundation.net/Ike Education to view our educator's guide, where we have descriptions of all of our programs and information about how to sign up. I hope to see you again soon.